she was there for all of it. When her brother built a world inside a canvas, he helped him shape it. When her parents tore the world apart, she was the one who decided to fix it on her own terms, by any means necessary. When 52 expeditions marched across a broken continent and never came back, her hands were in that too. And when the story of Expedition 33 finally reached its end, the woman most responsible for the shape of everything that happened was not the paintress weeping at the base of the monolith. It was her eldest daughter, fighting a war in the real world that most people in the canvas never even knew existed. My name is Vigil, and this is Video Game Lore. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most complex, morally layered, and deeply tragic figures in the entire world of Clair Obscur, Expedition 33. Before we go any further, I want to be upfront about something. The story of Clea is not one the game hands to you directly. It is assembled. It lives in the journals left behind by expeditioners who never made it home. It was written into the environments, the endless tower, the flying manor, the abyss, if you know how to read them. It surfaces in fragments of dialogue that require you to listen carefully and fill in the spaces between the words. And in several places, it requires something more than that. It requires interpretation, informed speculation, grounded in everything the lore gives us, but speculation nonetheless. Where I'm drawing directly from the game story, I will tell you, and where I'm offering my own reading of who Clea was, how she thought, and why she made the choices she made, I will tell you that too. This video is built on both, and I think that honestly matters, because Clea is the kind of character who deserves to be examined carefully, not casually. She was brilliant, she was ruthless, she loved her brother more than almost anything in the world, and when she lost him, something in her calcified into something that could justify nearly anything in the name of a goal she believed was right. She is not a villain, but she is not innocent either. And by the time this video is over, I think you will understand exactly how a woman who once helped her little brother build a treehouse inside a painted world became the architect of 67 years of suffering inside that same one. This is the story of Clea Dessendre. Let's begin. Though no precise date is recorded, Clea Dessendre came into the world around the year 1877, born to Renoir and Eileen Dessendre. 2 years later, on February 22, 1879, her brother Verso followed. From an early age, both children were guided by their mother in the art of harnessing their chroma, raised to carry forward the family's legacy and one day stand among the most powerful painters of their generation. Clea took it with a focus and intensity that set her apart almost immediately. Her gifts extend well beyond painting. She mastered the pedal harp and developed into a skilled sculptor as well. Driven by a pressure she placed largely upon herself, she buried herself in her studies with a discipline that left little room for anything else. She spent countless hours alone in her room, not simply practicing, but creating. She composed her own music, she painted concepts of surreal and fantastical creatures, and brought them further still, sculpting them into physical form. For Clea, art was not a pastime. It was a standard she was determined to meet and then exceed. Though the lore does not give us a precise timeline, Verso eventually created a canvas world of his own. He did not share Clea's consuming passion for painting, but he loved his sister deeply, and he could see what the weight of her self-imposed expectations was doing to her. One day, while Clea was at work in her study, Verso came to her and told her to set it all aside and come with him. There was something he wanted to show her. Out of love for her brother, she agreed. She put her work down and stepped through into his canvas. What greeted her was a vast, childlike world full of sweets and trains and wonder. Something built not out of ambition or legacy, but out of pure imagination. Verso had already begun to populate it with the living creatures of his own design. Among them were early forms of what the expeditioners would later come to know as the Grandis and the Gestrels. Creatures called the Barbasusette and the half-baked Gestrels, rough and whimsical precursors to the beings that would one day inhabit his fully realized world. The Licorne, too, were present, early designs that would eventually evolve into his rock turtle companion, Francois. Clea looked around at all of it, and something in her loosened. She decided she would help Verso build a treehouse. And for days, time always moved differently inside a canvas than in the world beyond it. The two of them simply played. Those days became some of the most important of their lives. The bond between them deepened into something that went beyond the usual ties of siblings. They became genuine friends, returning to the canvas again and again, practicing their instruments together, building and exploring, and laughing in a world that existed purely for the joy of it. In time, the rest of the family joined them there as well, gathering inside the canvas to celebrate one of Verso's birthdays. A moment of warmth and togetherness that the Dessendre family would carry with them long after in the real world. As time moved on, as it always does, Verso and Clea grew older. Verso, now 10, Clea around 12. And in the year 1889, the Dessendre family welcomed a third child into the world. Alicia had arrived. Clea, more mature now in both mind and discipline, pressed deeper into her mastery of chroma with the same focused intensity that had always defined her. Verso, meanwhile, was feeling the pressure from the outside world more acutely with each passing year. The expectation that he would dedicate himself fully to becoming a painter, bearing down on him in ways he could not yet articulate. He turned to what had always given him relief, retreating into the work of building and expanding his canvas world. But he missed his sister. He went to Clea and asked her to help him, to join him in taking his world further than he could take it alone. She loved him, and she agreed without hesitation, though she brought one condition with her. It was time to start fresh. The childlike quality of his earliest creations had served its purpose, but she felt the world deserved something more considered, more fully realized. Verso agreed. Together they established a new layer, a blank space built over the original draft of his world, a clean foundation on which something greater could be constructed. They began with the landscape itself, giving it shape and character and form. When it came to the creation of life, Clea stepped back and left that entirely to Verso. It was his world, and the living things within it should come from him. And so Verso created Esquier, his closest companion within the canvas, modeled after the childhood plushie he had carried with him for so long as he could remember. Clea's responsibility in the real world pulled her away periodically, her training demanding time and attention that could not be set aside. In her absence, Verso continued to work, refining the new layer, revisiting his original drafts, and spending his hours in the company of Esquier. When Clea returned, she found a world that had grown in her absence, and she threw herself back into it alongside him. Over the course of the next several years, she came to know his newest creations, the Gestrels, the Grandis, and Francois among them, who would come to consider Clea his best friend. She helped him design cities for the Gestrels to inhabit, and carved out vast, high mountain regions where the Grandis could make their home. The world took on a scale and depth that neither of them could have achieved alone. Verso never thought of it as solely his creation. As far as he was concerned, it belonged to both of them. And with every hour they spent inside it together, building something neither the real world nor its expectations could touch, the bond between them grew into something neither time nor distance would easily break. The lore does not tell us when the war between the writers and the painters first broke out, but when it did, it found Clea at a pivotal moment in her life. And what it demanded of her began to shape her in ways that would leave a permanent mark on the woman she was becoming. More than a decade had passed since those early days in Verso's canvas. The war was now in full swing, and Clea's parents were leaning on her creativity, her ingenuity, her ability to think and create in ways that others could not, to help turn the tide in the painter's favor. Clea accepted that role and internalized it completely. She began to see herself not merely as a participant in the war effort, but as essential to it. And with that certainty came something harder. Her remarks grew more cutting. Her expectations of those around her sharpened into demands. A degree of narcissism took root in her, quiet at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. The war had given her a sense of her own indispensability, and it was beginning to cost her something she may not have noticed she was losing. Through all of it, she and Verso continued to venture into his canvas together. Even as adults, the world they had built remained a place they returned to, though Clea, ever unable to let anything exist purely for its own sake, began to find ways to make it serve a greater purpose. She designed a structure that the expeditioners would one day come to know as the Endless Tower. It became her workshop, a place where she painted creatures into existence, each one more dangerous than the last, placing them at progressively higher levels as their tower climbed. She and Verso would fight their way through every floor together, sharpening their skills and pushing each other further with each attempt. Verso eventually gave the challenge a name. They called it the Gauntlet. What had begun as play had become something closer to preparation. and the line between the two was growing thinner with every passing year. Back in the real world, Clea found herself unable to connect with Alicia in the way she had always connected with Verso. The age gap between them was part of it, but it was not the whole of it. Alicia had no interest in painting. She had no desire to fight. What she loved was reading and writing. And in Clea's eyes, sharpened now by years of war and the belief that every member of the family had a role to play, that was not enough. She began to chide her, to belittle her. She told her she was of little use to the family in the current climate, that sitting alone in her room with her books while the rest of them fought and trained and created was a luxury none of them could afford. Alicia made no effort to join her or Verso in Verso's canvas when they visited, and Clea made even less effort to understand who her younger sister actually was. What Clea didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the writers had already found Alicia. In secret, they had made contact with her, and over time, they had begun to work on her in ways that were slow and deliberate and carefully hidden. The full nature of what they said to her, what they promised her, and what role she was truly meant to play remains one of the deepest unanswered questions in the lore. What is known is that a fire broke out in the west wing of the Dessendre manor. Alicia was caught inside it. The flames reached her face, and her screams cut through the manor before anyone could process what was happening. Verso heard her. He did not hesitate. He ran into the burning wing and found her, pulled her away from the worst of it, smothered the flames that had taken hold of her, and got her out. But in doing so, he had gone too deep into the fire. By the time Alicia was safe, the way back was gone. The flames had closed around him. He looked at his little sister through the heat and the smoke, and he smiled. He told her she was going to be all right. And then the fire took him. There was nothing anyone could do. Verso was gone. That single moment fractured the Dessendre family at every joint, sending each of them down a different path through their grief. But no one was struck harder by Verso's death than Clea. He had been her closest friend, the one she had never needed to perform for, never needed to justify herself to. The one relationship in her life that had existed entirely outside the war and the expectations and the weight of being essential. And now he was gone, taken by a fire that had been set in motion by the very people she was fighting against, through the sisters she had spent years dismissing and pushing away. What grief did to Clea Dessendre would not look like what it had done to the others. It would not look like depression or withdrawal or a desperate search for something to hold on to. It would look like something far more dangerous, and it would set her on a path from which she would not easily return. Clea and her father Renoir made the same choice in the face of their grief. They turned it into something with edges. Together, they began to plan their vengeance against the writers, channeling the loss of Verso into a cold and focused resolve to make those responsible pay for what they had taken. The war that had already been consuming their lives now had a personal dimension that neither of them would fully set aside. While Clea fought her war in the real world, another version of her was quietly beginning a life in a painted one. Eileen, shattered by the loss of her son, and unable to find any footing in a world that no longer contained it, had made a decision that would alter the course of everything. She took Verso's canvas into the atelier, stepped inside, driven by a grief so consuming that the boundary between what was real and what she needed to be real had ceased to matter to her. Once within the canvas, she set her chroma to work. She rebuilt a version of Paris from memory, rendering it as a painted city she named Lumi, and filled the streets with human inhabitants she conjured into being. Then, she turned to the things she wanted most. She poured every ounce of her skill and knowledge into creating painted versions of her family, Renoir, Verso, Alicia, and Clea among them, granting each one immortality and imbuing them with the full memories of their real-world counterparts. And then, Eileen settled into this new life, surrounded by the family she had rebuilt and the world her son had made. From this point forward, the canvas version of Clea will be referred to as Painted Clea, to distinguish her from the woman still fighting in the world outside. Painted Clea was, in almost every meaningful way, the same as the woman she had been painted from. The same sharp intellect, the same relentless work ethic, the same drive toward the mastery in everything she touched. She spent her days painting and sculpting, living what appeared to be an ordinary life alongside her family in the city Eileen had built. In time, she crossed paths with a friend of Painted Versos, a man named Simon, and what began as a friendship deepened gradually into love. The Painted family lived their lives together in Lumiere, and Eileen lived among them, and for a time, the world inside the canvas held together. Then Renoir arrived, and everything changed. The lore does not tell us exactly how long Eileen had been living inside the canvas by that point. What the dialogue suggests is that Renoir had managed to locate and hide the canvas on more than one occasion, attempting to cut off her access to it, but she always found it again. She always went back. In the real world, the war between the writers and the painters was escalating, and the writers were beginning to gain the upper hand. Renoir understood with increasing urgency that they needed the most gifted painter they had, his wife. But when he looked for her, what he found was a woman who had lost her position as head of the Painters' Council, who had been spending far too much time inside a canvas, and who was already showing early signs of chroma sickness. He had lost his son only months before. He was not willing to lose his wife as well. He went inside. What he found when he entered the canvas stopped him. The city Eileen had built, the family she had recreated, the life she had constructed around herself, in place of the one that had broken. He tried everything he could think of to reach her. He told her that the people surrounding her were not her real family. He told her that their actual children needed her, that the war demanded her, and that the world outside was suffering without her. He told her she was dying, that the chroma sickness was advancing, that staying inside this world any longer would take her from them the same way the fire had taken Verso. None of it reached her. What began as an argument became something far more violent. Both Renoir and Eileen unleashed the full force of their chroma against one another in a clash of staggering scale, and the world Verso and Clea had spent years building together shattered under the weight of it. The city of Lumiere was cast out to sea. The landscape of the continent was torn apart and remade, and from the collision of their power, the monolith rose, feeling Eileen at its peak and trapping Renoir beneath it, both of them locked in a stalemate that neither could break alone. In the aftermath, Painted Clea and the rest of the Painted family did what they could, helping the survivors, reorganizing the now isolated island city of Lumiere, and trying to make sense of a world that had been broken in a single afternoon. When Painted Renoir began organizing an expedition to venture out across the shattered continent and search for survivors, Painted Verso and Simon both signed on to join him. The lore does not tell us explicitly why Painted Clea did not go with them, but it is reasonable to assume she chose to stay behind to look after Painted Alicia and help the city rebuild, while the men departed. She said goodbye to Simon as Expedition Zero set sail, not knowing what the continent would do to the people she loved. Back in the real world, Clea noticed her father's absence. She returned to the manor and found what she had not expected, both her mother and father frozen inside the canvas. She made the decision to go in after them, and what she found on the other side of that threshold would set into motion a chain of events from which the canvas world would never fully recover. She stepped into the world she had helped Verso build and found it broken. The landscape they had shaped together over years of laughter and creation had been shattered and scattered, torn apart by the very two people who should have protected what it represented. The one thing that remained of her brother, the one thing they had shared since childhood, ruined by her mother's refusal to accept that Verso was gone, and her father's inability to pull Eileen back before the conflict consumed everything. She felt both of their chroma radiating from the monolith, one above, one below, and understood immediately what had happened. They were trapped, both of them, and the world she had poured herself into alongside Verso had paid the price for it. The anger that moved through her in that moment was not the sharp, focused kind she had carried through the war. It was something deeper and older than that. The grief of losing Verso, compounded by the fury of watching what remained of him be destroyed by the two people who claimed to love him most. She had had enough of all of it. She assessed the situation with the cold clarity that had always been her greatest weapon and identified the problem precisely. Her father was attempting to weaken Eileen by erasing her creations through the gamage, but the battle between them had depleted both of their reserves so severely that the process was moving at a crawl. And every time one of Eileen's creations died, for any reason, by any means, their chroma returned to her, replenishing her strength and allowing her to continue resisting. It was a cycle with no end in sight. Clea needed her father back in the real world. The war demanded it. And beyond the war, she had needed both of them out of the world she had a hand in building, the world they had now ruined. She knew what had to be done, and she went to do it. She made her way to her workshop in the Endless Tower and began to create. What she designed there were the Nevrons, built from the foundations of her sculptures and paintings, shaped with a singular and deliberate purpose. They would not simply kill. They would seal the chroma of every human they struck inside their own bodies, petrifying their victims rather than releasing their essence back into the world. Every death they caused would be a death that gave Eileen nothing. The flow of returning chroma would be cut off entirely, and without it, Eileen would slowly starve of the power keeping her strong. Clea worked with the exacting precision of someone who had spent a lifetime demanding perfection from herself and everything she touched. But perfection, even for Clea, was not always achieved on the first attempt. A subset of her Nevrons did not come out as intended. Pale, malformed things that fell short of the standard she had set. She was displeased with them. She created Blanche, a white counterpart to the Nevrons known as Renoir, and sent it out with the task of destroying what she considered abominations who were otherwise flawless enforcers. Blanche, however, could not bring itself to carry out the order. Created from the same brush as the very creatures it had been sent to destroy, it found itself unable to end them. It felt something close to sorrow for them, beings that existed without understanding their own purpose. And in the quiet of its own nature, Blanche held on to a hope that others might one day choose kindness over violence. Clea, consumed entirely by the work at hand, left Blanche to its task and turned her attention elsewhere. She continued to create, each new Nevron more lethal than the last, sending wave after wave of them out into the world below. They hunted without mercy, striking at the scattered survivors across the continent, and eventually turning their attention toward the isolated city of Lumiere itself. It was during this time that Clea spotted the ships of Expedition Zero moving across the sea. She watched them with the cold and detached curiosity of someone studying a specimen. Her mother's creations, venturing out into a world they did not understand. And then she saw them. Painted Renoir, painted Verso. The sight of them, her brother's face, her father's face, walking around inside a canvas world as though they had every right to exist, struck her as a profound and personal affront, an insult to Verso's memory, a reminder of everything her mother had refused to let go of. She must have made her way to Lumiere at some point to confirm what she had already suspected, that Eileen had painted a version of her as well. And when she saw how her mother had rendered her, something shifted in Clea's thinking. A plan began to take shape. The lore does not give us a precise timeline for what happened next, but at some point, Clea located Painted Clea, took her. She brought her to one of the floating islands, a place that would come to be known as the Flying Manor, and established a workshop there inside a large atelier. She began to paint over her painted counterpart, extracting from her everything she needed. Information about the painted family, their dynamics, their vulnerabilities, and the man Painted Clea loved, Simon. Then Clea did something that, even measured against everything else she had done, stands as one of the most chilling decisions of her life. She stripped Painted Clea of everything she was, her personality, her autonomy, her sense of self, and turned her into something else entirely, a machine, a mindless, endlessly productive engine of destruction. Her chroma amplified far beyond what it had been, capable of generating hundreds of thousands of Nevrons and pouring them into the canvas world without pause or hesitation. Painted Clea, the woman who had once fallen in love and built a life in Lumiere, was gone. What remained stood in the atelier of the Flying Manor and created and created and created, without thought, without feeling, without end. With that taken care of, Clea turned her full attention back to Expedition Zero and the rest of Eileen's painted family. There was still work to be done. Clea met them at the barrier surrounding the monolith. Painted Renoir and Painted Verso could not have been fully prepared for what they were looking at. A woman who was in every visible sense one of their own, standing on the other side of everything they believed. Clea explained to both of them exactly what they were, what they had always been. She had hoped that the truth would be enough, that knowing they were painted creations rather than real men would turn them against Eileen and bring them to her side. But the two of them, still bound by the memories and feelings Eileen had woven into them, still believing on some level that the woman at the top of the monolith was their mother and their wife, refused to stand down. They would not turn back. Something in Clea broke open. She unleashed everything she had, her own considerable chroma, and almost certainly her Nevrons as well. And when the violence was over, the expedition had been wiped out, every member of it, or so she believed. As she surveyed the aftermath, she noticed that Painted Renoir and Painted Verso had not been destroyed. Eileen's gift of immortality had held. The two of them looked at the devastation surrounding them and made the decision to retreat, to return to Lumiere and tell the people there what they had seen and heard. Clea let them go and turned her attention back to the wreckage, and that was when she saw him. One member of the expedition had survived. He was still breathing among the fallen. recovering slowly from what had been done to him. It was Simon, painted Clea's beloved. He looked up at her through the haze of his recovery, and for a moment, the sight of her face must have stopped him cold. He thought he was looking at painted Clea. Clea told him the truth about who she was, and then she told him something else, that she had found a way through the barrier, a way to reach the paintress and end what she was doing to the world. She raised her hand and began to paint over him, enhancing his chroma and sharpening his power beyond what it had been. She told him that if he could destroy one of the axons, the heart it left behind could be used to break through the barrier and reach the paintress. He pointed him toward the axon she had in mind, the one known as the Holler, which Renoir had created, and which resided in what remained of old Lumiere. The axon that Clea no doubt understood had been shaped as a representation of herself. Simon left without a word. He found the Holler and fought it in a battle that must have been as brutal as it was desperate, and he brought it down. Clea fashioned a weapon from its heart, most likely the very sword Simon would later carry into the abyss, and enhanced it further with her own formidable chroma. Unlike the barrier breaker that Expedition 33 would eventually require 2 axon hearts to create, this blade carried enough of Clea's power on its own to do what needed to be done. Simon drove it into the barrier and pressed through. He made his way up through the monolith, level by level, until he reached the top, and there he found Eileen. Eileen was not unprepared. She understood immediately that Clea had sent him there, and she turned the situation with a precision that Clea had not anticipated. She told Simon the truth was the opposite of what he had been led to believe, that Clea was the paintress, that she had taken painted Clea and was holding her prisoner, and that everything Simon had been told was a lie, designed to get him to destroy the world that contained the woman he loved. She told him that if he descended into the abyss and destroyed the man trapped there, he could stop the Gamage and free painted Clea from whatever Clea had done to her. Simon believed her. He turned away from Eileen and descended into the abyss. He was never seen again. The plan had failed. Eileen had outmaneuvered her. Clea accepted the setback and returned to what she could control. She left painted Clea to her endless work in the Flying Manor and made her way back to the real world, intending to continue the fight against the riders and check in on the canvas when circumstances allowed. What she found when she arrived home was the same thing she had left. Her parents, frozen in the atelier, still locked in their stalemate inside the canvas. She went back in. Inside, decades had passed. It was now Monolith Year 57, and the world had moved on without her. A new expedition was making its way across the continent. Expedition 57, and it was unlike anything that had come before it. This one was large, well organized, and heavily equipped. War machines, trebuchets, a force that had clearly been built with the specific intention of carving its way through to the monolith by sheer overwhelming force. Clea watched them advance with something that might in another life have been respect, but she could not allow them to destroy what she had built. She returned to her workshop in the Endless Tower and went to work. What emerged from that workshop was one of the most formidable Nevrons she had ever created, the Duelist. She sent it out alongside an army of large and devastating Nevrons, the Bourgeon, the Remasseur, and the Chalier. The battle that followed was massive in scale and absolute in its outcome. Not one member of Expedition 57 survived. Clea looked at the result and understood that brute force on either side was not going to resolve what was happening inside this canvas. She needed a different approach. She had noticed that Painted Verso had quietly withdrawn from Painted Renoir's campaign, that he was no longer actively hunting expeditioners and feeding their chroma back to Eileen. She sought him out and attempted to recruit him. He wanted his immortality to end. He wanted his mother's suffering to stop. Their goals, she argued, were aligned. Painted Verso listened to everything she said, and then declined. Calmly and without hostility, but without any room for negotiation either. He did not trust her. The refusal infuriated her in a way that went beyond the tactical. It was personal, the way most things involving the painted versions of her family had become personal. She went back to work. Over the next 7 monolith years, she designed and created Nevrons of increasing danger and complexity, pushing the boundaries of what she had built before. And she found another way to accelerate the drain on Elaine's power. She created more than a dozen massive Nevrons with a singular purpose: to consume the landscape itself, eating away at the very chroma the world was made of, depleting the canvas at its foundation, and cutting off yet another source of power Eileen might draw upon. What came next would shift the balance of the canvas world in a way Clea had been working toward for years. Before we continue, it is worth noting that what follows is grounded in the events of the in-game story, but with some added speculation on my part. What you are about to hear is my interpretation of who Clea is, how she thought, and what she was willing to do, and I wanted to be transparent about that as we move forward. During the period corresponding to Monolith Year 49, Clea emerged from the campus and found Alicia waiting in the manor. She explained the situation plainly. The stalemate between their parents was holding. Her Nevrons were in place and doing their work, but Eileen's painted versions of the family had proven far more resilient than she had anticipated. Painted Verso in particular had been anything but the passive bystander she had hoped he would become. She told Alicia that the writers were gaining ground in the real world, and that she had critical tasks demanding her attention, and that she needed Renoir back. She needed him now. What follows is where my speculation began, and I want to be clear about that as we move through it. It is my belief that Clea, with the sharp and calculating mind she had spent a lifetime honing, saw an opportunity in Alicia that went beyond the surface of their conversation. She knew her mother's chroma permeated every corner of the canvas. She knew that an inexperienced painter, stepping inside without the skill or preparation to resist it, would be overwhelmed almost immediately, repainted, absorbed, remade into something of Eileen's design. And I believe Clea knew this. I believe she walked into that conversation with Alicia already knowing how it would end, and that everything she said was chosen with that outcome in mind. Alicia asked if there was anything she could do to help. Clea set her manipulations in motion, with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped feeling conflicted about using people. She told Alicia she was weak, that she would be of no use, that everything, Verso's death, the fire, all of it, had been her fault to begin with. She let those words settle, let the guilt and the need to make things right do their work, and then, almost as an afterthought, she told Alicia that if she truly wanted to help, she should go into the canvas and assist Renoir, help break the stalemate and bring him back to the real world where he was needed. Then, Clea left. Whether she went to brief others fighting against the writers on what she had set in motion, we cannot say for certain. What we do know is that while she was gone, Alicia took the canvas and hid it, ensuring Eileen would not be able to find her way back to it. When Clea returned and saw what Alicia had done, something close to approval crossed her face. The plan was working exactly as she had intended. She guided Alicia on how to enter the canvas, and when Alicia stepped through, Eileen's chroma was waiting for her. It overwhelmed her before she could find her footing, and her mother began to paint over her. Clea watched it happen, and did nothing to stop it. She had known it would. Alicia was reborn into the canvas, and the woman who would one day be known as Maëlle came into existence. This is the second part of my speculation, and again I want to be transparent about that. I believe that Clea, even in engineering Alicia's absorption into the canvas, was thinking several moves ahead. She understood that Painted Verso wanted the same thing she wanted, an end to Eileen's hold on the canvas, and an end to his own immortality. She knew that the real Verso's memories and love for Alicia lived inside him, and she believed that if Alicia existed within the canvas world, growing up there, becoming part of it, Painted Verso would protect her, that his attachment to her would eventually make him useful in ways that direct recruitment never could. She returned to the canvas one more time and found Painted Verso. She told him what had happened to Alicia. He listened, and the memories of the real Verso did exactly what she had anticipated. He agreed to watch over the child as she grew up in Lumiere. When he left to fulfill that promise, Clea left as well, stepping back out into the real world and returning to the war against the Riders. She left the fate of the canvas to her sister and to the Nevrons she had built, and she did not look back. Many years passed inside the canvas. Expeditions continued to venture out, fall, and eventually Expedition 33 set out on the journey that would bring everything to its conclusion. When Alicia and Painted Verso finally discovered the flying manor and entered the atelier within it, they found what Clea had left behind 67 years earlier. Painted Clea stood with her back to them, pale and covered in chroma stains, endlessly summoning Nevrons into existence in a cycle that had never once paused. She turned. The hollow expression on her face said everything about what had been done to her. She had been bound to that atelier for 67 years, not as a person, but as a machine, and she had not resisted for a single moment of it. When she registered the presence of intruders, she summoned her creations and attacked. They fought her and brought her down, but Clea's enhancements and Eileen's gift of immortality allowed her to recover almost instantly. She rose again with her arms outstretched, her power surging back as though the fight had meant nothing. And then she saw painted Verso. Something shifted. The hollow expression cracked, just barely, just for a moment, and recognition moved across her face like light through a closing door. They began to move toward one another. For one fragile, suspended moment, painted Clea was herself again. Then, Clea's hold reasserted itself, crushing whatever had surfaced, and snapping her back to the only purpose she had been left with. In that moment of returning clarity, painted Clea understood something that had perhaps always been true, that she could not be saved. What remained of her will, she used deliberately and without hesitation. She turned her own Nevron creations against herself, summoning them over and over, letting them do what they had been built to do. Painted Verso pleaded with her to stop. She could not be reached. The attacks continued until the atelier filled with the sound of 67 years of pain finally finding its release. A scream, and then a burst of chroma that tore outward from within her and left almost nothing behind. A faint fragment of essence drifted in the air where she had stood. Painted Clea was gone. The rest of Clea's story remains unwritten by the game itself. The developers have been clear that the two endings available to the player are non-canonical, entirely open to interpretation, with neither presented as the definitive truth. With that in mind, we'll be focusing on the ending that gives us the most insight to what becomes of Clea, the one that unfolds if you choose to fight as painted Verso and bring the canvas to its end. How much time passes between the erasure of the canvas and what follows in the real world is never made clear. But when we return to the Dessendre family, we find them outside the manor, together, and for the first time in what feels like an eternity, moving in the same direction. The weight of Verso's death, which had sent each of them spiraling down their own separate paths of grief and destruction, is finally beginning to lift. They are not healed, but they are healing. And that is something none of them could have said for a very long time. Clea stands among them, holding a bouquet of red and white flowers, the same colors that had marked the Gamage ceremonies in the canvas world. She looks at Alicia, and for a moment, something crosses her face that does not come naturally to her. A smile. Brief, and not without its complications, but genuine in its own way. Alicia returns it. Whatever distance existed between them, and there had been a great deal of it, built up over years of coldness and blame, and the kind of cruelty that passes itself off as honesty, something in it has shifted. Clea steps forward and places the flowers on Verso's grave. The family stands together in a moment of silence for the brother and son they lost, and for a breath, the world is still. Renoir and Eileen find each other. They embrace, fully, without reservation. Two people who have spent decades on opposite sides of the same grief, finally standing on the same ground. Clea watches them. She takes it in for exactly as long as she needs to, and then she rolls her eyes and turns and walks away. Not out of bitterness, or at least not entirely, but because Clea has never been someone who lingers in moments. There's work to be done. The war against the Riders has not paused for any of this, and the upper hand they have been gaining is not going to reverse itself on its own. With Renoir finally free of the canvas, and perhaps, at long last, with Eileen as well, the painters may finally have what they need to turn the tide. Clea has been fighting this war alone for longer than anyone should have to. That, at least, is about to change. Clea Dessendre is not a villain, but she is not a hero either. She exists in the difficult and uncomfortable space between the two, a place that the story of Clair Obscur, Expedition 33, understands better than most. She was brilliant from the beginning, and she knew it. She was driven, disciplined, and capable of creation that rivaled her mother's at her peak. But those same qualities that made her exceptional also made her dangerous, because Clea never learned the difference between being necessary and being right. The war gave her a sense of purpose that slowly became a sense of superiority, and the loss of Verso, the one person who had ever made her set all of that down, removed the only thing that had ever truly softened her. What grief did to Renoir was imprisoning. What grief did to Clea was sharpen her into something that cut everyone around her, often without her even noticing. She manipulated her sister. She turned a painted version of herself into a machine, and left her in an atelier for 67 years. She sent a man who loved the painted version of herself into an abyss he never came back from. She did all of that with the calm certainty of someone who had long since decided that the ends not only justified the means, but demanded them. And the most unsettling part is that she was not entirely wrong. The canvas needed to end. Eileen needed to come home. Renoir needed to be free. Clea saw all of that clearly when no one else could, or would. But clarity without compassion is just another word for coldness, and Clea had been cold for a very long time. What the ending of this story offers her, standing at Verso's grave, placing flowers, watching her parents finally hold each other, is not redemption. It is something quieter and more honest than that. It is the first real moment of stillness she has had since the fire. And if the war against the riders is truly about to turn, and if Clea Dessendre is finally going to have the people beside her that she has been fighting without for all of these months, then perhaps the most interesting chapter of her story is not the one we just told. Perhaps it is the one that comes next. And that is Clea Dessendre, a woman who helped build a world in her brother's canvas and then spent decades dismantling it. A woman who was right about almost everything that needed to happen and wrong about almost every way she chose to make it happen. A woman who fought a war largely alone, made choices that no one else was willing to make, and stood at her brother's grave at the end of it all, not broken, not redeemed, but still standing, still moving forward. Still, in her own way, carrying the weight of everything she had done and refusing to put it down. She is one of the most compelling characters this world has produced, and I have a feeling her story is far from over. But Clea is not the only one in this world whose story deserves to be told in full. Because for every expedition that walked out of Lumiere and into the dark, there were people on those ships who carried entire lives with them. People with histories, losses, and reasons for going that went far deeper than duty or desperation. And two of those people have been with us since the beginning of Expedition 33's journey, fighting beside Alicia, holding the group together when it was coming apart, and carrying secrets of their own that the main story only ever partially uncovered. Next time on Video Game Lore, we are turning our full attention to Ciel and Lume, two women whose bond, whose grief, and whose individual stories are far richer and more layered than even the main narrative had time to fully explore. We are going back through the journals, the environmental storytelling, and every piece of dialogue the game gave us to build the most complete picture of both of them that we can. And if the story of Clea taught us anything, it is that the characters standing just outside the center of the frame are often carrying the most interesting stories of all. That video is coming. Make sure you are subscribed and that notification bell is on so you do not miss it the moment it drops. If this video brought you value, if Clea's story hit you the way it hit me, like it, share it with someone who loves a story worth digging into, and drop a comment below. I want to know what you think of Clea. Was she justified? Was she a villain? Was she something else entirely? Tell me where you land. This community is what makes this worth doing. This has been Vigil, and this is Video Game Lore, and I will see you in the next one.